After Trans Studies, Andrea Longchu and Emmett Harson Drager. Abstract. This dialogue contends with the state of trans studies today. While the authors differ in their levels of optimism for its future, they both agree that if trans studies is to survive, it must be able to articulate a fresh set of reading practices distinct from, or even at odds with, those of queer studies. Revisiting Sandy Stone's field-defining 1991 essay, The Empire Strikes Back, they note that trans studies paradoxically begins with a call to abandon the figure of the transsexual, imagined solely as a normative medical category. In contrast, the authors argue that the critical value of the transsexual lies precisely in her being an obstacle to romantic narratives of anti-normative queerness. Andrea Longchu. Let's face it, trans studies is over. If it isn't, it should be. Thus far, trans studies has largely failed to establish a robust, compelling set of theories, methods, and concepts that would distinguish itself from gender studies or queer studies. Susan Stryker once wrote that trans studies was queer theory's evil twin. She was wrong. Trans studies is the twin that queer studies ate in the womb. The womb, as usual, was feminism. What everyone knows is that queer theory has never had any qualms about arrogating gender as one of its primary sites of inquiry, and reasonably so, since trying to study sexuality without studying gender would be manifestly absurd. Queer has, from the get-go, described both gender and sexual deviance, and what's more, gender as sexual deviance and sexuality as gender deviance. From this perspective, trans studies is just an embarrassing redundancy, junk DNA. In trans studies, there is nothing like the rich conversations about queer temporalities that took place in queer theory in the mid-aughts, or like the recent debates over Afro-pessimism in Black studies, both of which owe a lot to polemics and their subsequent fallouts. Instead, we have warmed over pieties. This is what happens when a massive offload of queer methods and concepts with the label trans hastily slapped over their expiration dates meets an influx of political capital courtesy of the current transgender identity politics. The result is something like church. But what matters, from the perspective of theory building, is strife. I'm very conservative when it comes to discipline formation. We need a small number of very good monographs that we can really yell at each other over. Can you think of a single significant debate in trans studies today? Bickering is everywhere, but true disagreement, the kind that births theories, is rare. Why are we so nice to each other? I think a lot of us are itching for a fight. On Liking Women was a desperate attempt to be disagreed with. In that regard, it's largely failed. Emmett Harson Drager. I cannot offer you the disagreement you are looking for, except perhaps to say that I do not think trans studies is over. In fact, I think it's potentially at a very exciting crossroads. I think that some of the most cited texts about trans people and in trans studies have been the work of non-trans, i.e. cis, scholars recycling the same citations, concepts, and metaphors. What cis scholar is going to intervene and say, hey, I think we have this concept of dysphoria all wrong? That's just not going to happen. Instead, we get the same arguments for bodily autonomy, the radical potential of body modification, or even worse, arguments from cis folks as to why social transition is as meaningful and transformative as medical transition. And even among trans scholars that are here in the field, no one wants to talk about how anticlimactic surgery really is, or how dysphoria maybe never goes away. That would be seen as undermining our gradual march toward progress. You cite Edelman as an example of the type of polemic we need. We are in the era of the trans child. It would be absolutely unfounded to imagine a trans studies scholar saying that perhaps actually, trans children should not be given hormones. As a field, we do not allow for those kinds of disagreements. Everything must be gender affirming, whatever that means. Trans studies is not over, but it does need to learn to stand on its own, not as an addendum or a hyphen or an asterisk to something else. I think that is exactly what we are here to discuss, how to make something out of this junk DNA. For me, the problem of trans studies has been a problem of narrative. I have been highly influenced by scholars who think about the role of narrative in historical inquiry. As Hayden White has argued, all historical inquiry is shaped by narrative emplotment. A historical project must take the form of a plot. It is at its very core a story, a romance, a tragedy, a comedy, a satire. In David Scott's Conscripts of Modernity, he argues that the post-colonial is trying to use the same toolkit, or as he calls it, problem space, as the anti-colonial. He suggests that while romance, a genre about triumph, was necessary for anti-colonial resistance, tragedy is a more apt genre for describing post-colonial modernity. In trans studies, it seems to me that we are telling a story of our victimhood, tragedy, or a story of our resistance, romance. I am much more interested in a satire, a genre about how truly disappointing and sometimes even boring it is to be a trans person in this world. As White argues, history's told us satires gain their effects precisely by frustrating normal expectations about the kinds of resolutions provided by stories cast in other modes. This is our task, to write a trans satire. ALC. I think you're exactly right to say that trans studies has a narrative problem. As queer, as an analytic, has reached a point of analytic exhaustion, queer studies scholars have had to entertain other vehicles for the romantic fantasy of criticism as a radical political act, which queer has sheltered for the past 20 years. The big secret about trans studies is that its working definition of trans is just queer again. So this is what trans studies could offer, a safe house for queer studies' endangered political optimism, as Robin Wiegman puts it. This is why most trans studies scholars are, in fact, just queer studies scholars especially susceptible to fads. Consider, for instance, the paper that most scholars cite as their method in that introductory phase of a book, chapter, or article where scholars are most anxious to look as if they're taking a strong theoretical position. It's the introduction to a 10-year-old special issue of WSQ, whose editors reject the implicit nominalism of trans in favor of the explicit relationality of trans, which remains open-ended and resists premature foreclosure by attachment to any single suffix. The basic idea is that transgender people, as a narrow identity group, can be a methodological stepping stone for thinking more expansively about boundary crossings of all sorts, not just transgender, but also transnational, transracial, transspecies. You get the picture. And so the editors gift us with Transing, Queering's unasked-for sequel. Like most sequels, it's just the same damn movie with a few plot elements lightly rearranged. Anyone who says differently is lying. Do we seriously imagine that any graduate student from 1998, plucked by the power of imaginative thinking, from the windowless basement cubicle where she takes refuge from the male professors who stand too close to her at holiday parties, do we seriously imagine that such a graduate student, having been asked to describe what it means to queer something, would reply, "Oh, it's about firm boundaries and stability and also fixedness"? But trans satire, I think, has the potential to become a real substantive methodology, not rejecting narration as such, which is impossible, but trying to learn how to write without optimism, or maybe how to be optimistic without being hopeful. Then again, I do suspect that writing without optimism is also impossible, insofar as I am persuaded by Lauren Berlant that all attachment is optimistic if we describe optimism as the force that moves you out of yourself and into the world in order to bring closer the satisfying something that you cannot generate on your own, but sense in the wake of a person, a way of life, an object, project, concept, or scene. Perhaps what I mean then is writing without political optimism, that is, writing without the subsumption of all optimistic attachment under the sign of the political. Call this a bitter optimism, maybe. Bitterness feels right to me as one of the primary critical effects of trans satire as we are imagining it here, not cynicism, which is a way of titrating bitterness until you can't taste it anymore, but real bitterness, the bitter disappointment of finding out the world is too small for all our desires, and especially the political ones. I know I'm bitter. I get the sense you are too. EHD. Trans studies political optimism has been grounded in the figure of the post-transsexual. Trans studies has been largely shaped by The Empire Strikes Back, a post-transsexual manifesto, in which Sandy Stone tells a story about the university-based gender clinics and the development of a differential diagnosis, gender identity disorder. In Stone's version of the story, patients desperate to sneak past the medical gatekeepers would rehearse and perform a false or inauthentic record of their lives in order to qualify for sex reassignment surgery. They would circulate among themselves copies of Harry Benjamin's The Transsexual Phenomenon in order to know what to tell the doctors in their intake interviews. Stone tells this story in order to highlight the rehearsed nature of trans self-narrativizing and autobiography, and in doing so she gestures to questions of authenticity. She is concerned specifically with the collapsing of emergent polyvocalities into one medicalized narrative discourse. Stone describes the trans body as a genre, a set of embodied texts. For Stone, medical hegemony reduces a multiplicity of lived experiences, embodiments, and identities into one story of transness, the wrong body narrative, one trajectory of embodiment, medical transition, and one identity category, the passing transsexual. Stone's manifesto calls for the transsexual to forego passing, to be consciously read, to read oneself aloud, and in doing so, embrace transsexuality as an intertextuality, a multiplicity of genres. This history of the gender clinics, as Stone tells it, provides the foundation for a set of binaries that have become the core problem space of trans studies for the last 30 years. Authenticity versus inauthenticity, medical identities versus vernacular identities, and the transsexual versus the post-transsexual, i.e. the transgender. I don't think Stone intended to create these binaries, but regardless, this is how her article has shaped years of scholarship about transgenders, lives, and identities. Stone is specifically calling for a new kind of transsexual, a post-transsexual, or, as I would argue, a non-transsexual. In her manifesto, a foundational text for the field, she urges us to tell our stories differently from the medicalized transsexual, establishing at the very foundation of trans studies the disavowal of the transsexual. And trans studies scholars have been myopically preoccupied with proving that we are no longer that ever since. There's an abundance of trans writing out there that I would describe as diagnostic, in the sense that the authors will choose whatever trans autobiography or memoir or television show is popular at the time and demonstrate how it is different from trans narratives in the past. Perhaps unwittingly, these authors are following the call of Stone by attempting to diagnose a narratological shift in which we go from being the medicalized story that Stone outlines to a new kind of polyvocal, intertextual, recalcitrant post-transsexual. This is very much in the vein of the romantic genre, and in our diagnosis, we always want to prove that we are on the right side, or I would say, the woke side of the narratological shift. For me, this project of incessantly trying to prove that we are no longer the medicalized transsexual is the very place where trans studies has lived and will die. It is an obsession with resistance and radicality that has severely limited our ability to fully understand trans pasts and presents. And this is why I am interested in returning to the fraught figure of the 1960s and 1970s transsexual, specifically the U.S. gender clinic patients or aspiring patients, to try to create a more robust history of trans that is not rooted in these binaries of vernacular versus medical and authentic versus inauthentic, but rather is full of messiness, contradictions, disappointments, and unexpected outcomes. ALC. And it's no accident, I'll add, that the transsexual is the only thing that trans can describe that queer can't. The transsexual is not queer. This is the best thing about her. Take Agnes, the pseudonymous transsexual woman who famously posed as intersex at UCLA's Gender Identity Clinic in the late 50s in order to obtain access to vaginoplasty. Agnes's case was chronicled by Harold Garfinkel in an article that's now taught in trans studies courses. It's the 6th entry in the Transgender Studies Reader. Agnes is regularly celebrated as some kind of gender ninja, savvy, tactical, carefully conning the medical industrial complex into giving her what she wants. What no one wants to talk about is what she actually wanted: a cunt, a man, a house, a normal fucking life. Whatever intuition she may not have had about gender as a managed achievement was put toward a down payment on a new dishwasher. If there's anything Agnes reveals about gender, it's that actually existing normatively is, strictly speaking, impossible. Norms as such do not exist. If Gender Trouble knew this, it did a poor job explaining it. That doesn't mean that norms don't structure people's desires. What it means is that the desire for the norm consists, in terms of its lived content, in non-normative attempts at normativity. Agnes was a non-normative subject, but that wasn't because she was against the norm. On the contrary, her non-normativity was what wanting to be normal actually looked like. Like most of us, Agnes was making do in the gap between what she wanted and what wanting it got her. We can argue, and people have, about whether queer theory is possible without anti-normativity. But whatever comes after trans studies, can I suggest transsexual theory, will be impossible with anti-normativity. The most powerful intervention scholars working in trans studies can make, at this juncture within the academy, is to defend the claim that transness requires that we understand, as we never have before, what it means to be attached to a norm, by desire, by habit, by survival. EHD. I think you're precisely right about this idea that transsexuality is perhaps a key to understanding norms and how they function, which is exactly what I was trying to say about the pitfalls of only looking for stories that are of resistance or radical politics. What interests me about the historical impulse is how much it is motivated by a deep desire to find people in the past who may have looked and lived like us. This is a project of finding community across time. But I ask, what do we do with the historical figures that we find that don't live up to our expectations? We want to find the Sylvia Riveras and Marsha P. Johnsons, but more often than not, we are going to find people that deeply disappoint us. What is our responsibility to them? For this reason, I was recently quite inspired by Finn Enk's TSQ piece, Collective Memory and the Transfeminist 1970s, in which they ask why, despite all the various complexities of 1970s feminism, it is collectively remembered as simply non-inclusive, anti-trans, white feminism. Enk urges us to pay attention to collective memory and how often it is more a reflection of the present than of the past. They wonder, why are we so perversely attached to a legacy of second-wave feminism that frames this time as only a place of injury and victimization for trans people? I echo this by asking, why, as a field, are we so perversely detached from the transsexual? Despite the many heterogeneous, multiracial, multi-class, and transnational individuals who sought sex reassignment surgery at the university-based gender clinics, somehow these transsexuals, or aspiring transsexuals, are remembered quite monolithically as white, middle-class, heterosexual, aspiring, trans women. What I find so compelling about Enk's argument is that these moments, this history, our history, deserves an analysis informed by a larger archive. The fortunate thing about the university-based gender clinics of the 60s and 70s is that, due to their university affiliation, they have left behind staggeringly large archives. In regards to transsexual history, we can hardly complain of erasure and archival lack. My own research into the clinics has found university collections to be rich sites for inquiry that challenge some of the core beliefs of trans studies, e.g., the very notion of medical identity. As historians and filmmakers have shown, trans women's and men's own words are readily available. It's possible to find and amplify the perspectives and lives even of people no longer with us, and to know them for their work and play, not just as lightning rods for transphobia. Just as you are interested in the question of what we do with people in our communities who have bad politics, I'm interested in what we do with figures of the past that are disappointing to us because they fail to live up to some kind of radical litmus test. This is really where our projects meet and overlap in questions of negative affect and bad objects. ALC. And there is no object worse than a woman. That's an operating assumption in all of my work. The problem with the transsexual is that she, and paradigmatically she is a she, especially if we're talking about 20th, 21st century US culture more broadly, carries all the baggage of gender with her. Like many women, she overpacks. The problem with the transsexual is that she's always been too much of a woman. It's hard to make something as politically dowdy as a woman into a cover girl for that trendy new metaphysics you're hawking. It's become quite fashionable in the past 20 years to talk about queerness or blackness, and more recently transness, in an ontological way, often in Heideggerian tones. At the same time, it remains the case that being dumb enough to write a book about womanness would get you bounced from all the cool academic clubs faster than you can say intersectionality. I am not arguing that anyone should be writing about womanness. I am simply pointing out that no one could, even if they wanted to, at least not if they wanted to get a job or a book contract in the current academic climate. Meanwhile, trans studies remains a field in which two men can sit around and debate the merits of woman as a political category. Spoiler alert, they have their doubts.